Welcome to the channel Timeless Detective Tales. Mr. Monday by George Simenon. In the Maigret saga. Maigret stood still for a moment in front of the black iron gate that separated him from the garden, and on which an enamel plate bore the number 47B. It was 5 o'clock in the evening, and darkness had fallen. Behind him a branch of the Seine flowed sullenly round the deserted Isle de Puteaux, with its thickets and tall poplars and patches of waste ground. In front of him, however, on the other side of the gate was a small modern private house, a typical Neuilly house with all the elegance and comfort of the Bois de Boulogne district, its garden now carpeted with autumn leaves. Number 47B was at the corner of the Boulevard de la Seine and the Rue Maxime Beyes. On the first floor some rooms were lit up, and Maigret, hunching his shoulders under the rain, decided to ring the bell. It is always embarrassing to disturb a peaceful house, particularly on a winter's evening when it seems to be guarding its privacy and its cozy warmth, and above all when the intruder has come from police headquarters with his pockets full of horrible documents. A light went on downstairs, a door opened and a servant, before crossing the garden in the rain, tried to catch a glimpse of the visitor. "What is it?" he asked through the gate. "Dr. Baran, please." In the elegant hallway Maigret automatically thrust his pipe into his pocket. "Who shall I say?" "You must be Martin Vignelet, the chauffeur," said the superintendent, to the man's considerable surprise. At the same time he slipped his visiting card into an envelope, which he then closed. Vignelet was a man of about 45 to 50, with prominent bones and thick hair, obviously of peasant origin. He went up to the first floor, and returned a few minutes later. Maigret followed him up, passing a child's pram on the way. "Please come in," said Dr. Armand Barayan, opening the door of his consulting room. He had the deeply shadowed eyes and the pallor of a man who has not slept for several days. Maigret had not even begun to speak when he noticed the sound of children's voices at play on the ground floor. Before entering the house, he already knew what the household consisted of. Dr. Barayan, a specialist in lung diseases and a former intern at Laennec Hospital, had only lived in Neuilly for the past 3 years, and besides his practice he kept up his laboratory research. He was married and had 3 children, a boy of 7, a girl of 5 and a baby a few months old, whose pram Maigret had observed. The domestic staff consisted of Martin Vignelet, who was both chauffeur and valet, of his wife Eugenie who did the cooking, and finally, until 3 weeks previously, of an 18-year-old Breton girl, Olga Boulanger. "I assume, doctor, that you're aware of the reason for my visit." Following the post-mortem, the Boulanger family have taken legal advice and have lodged an action, as plaintiffs, and I have been instructed. His whole attitude seemed apologetic, and indeed it was not without a sense of embarrassment that he had begun to tackle this case. 3 weeks earlier Olga Boulanger had died in somewhat mysterious circumstances. Nonetheless the registrar had issued a death certificate and the burial had taken place. The parents had come from Brittany for the funeral, typical peasants, tough and mistrustful, and they had learnt, heaven knows how, that their daughter was 4 months pregnant. Someone had put them in touch with Barthet, a particularly acrimonious lawyer, and on his advice they had, a week later, demanded exhumation and an autopsy. "I have the report with me," Maigret sighed, indicating his pocket. "Don't bother. I know all about it, particularly as I got permission to assist the pathologist." He was calm, although exhausted and probably feverish. He was wearing his lab coat. With the lamplight full on his face, he looked Maigret in the eyes without ever flinching. "I needn't add that I was expecting you, Superintendent." On his desk, in a metal frame, stood a photo of his wife, a pretty woman of barely 30 with an air of delicate refinement. "Since you have Dr. Paul's report in your pocket, you must be aware that we found the unfortunate girl's intestine riddled with tiny perforations, which quickly brought on septicemia. You must know, too, that after meticulous researches we succeeded in establishing the cause of these perforations, which my distinguished colleague and I found most disturbing. It worried us so much that we called in a colonial doctor to our aid, and he solved the problem." Maigret nodded. Barayan, who seemed to guess what he was longing for, broke off to say, "Please smoke if you like." "I don't myself, since my patients are mainly children." "A cigar?" "No." "I'll go on. The method used to kill my servant, for I'm positive she was killed, is apparently well known in Malaya and the New Hebrides. The victim is induced to swallow a certain number of those slender beards, as sharp as needles, that grow on ears of various cereals, including rye. These beards remain in the bowel, the lining of which they gradually pierce, and the inevitable result, excuse me." Maigret sighed. The post-mortem also confirmed that Olga Boulanger was 4.5 months pregnant. Could she have got into bad company? No. She seldom or never went out. She was rather a gawky little thing with a freckled face, and he hastily returned to his subject. "I must confess, Superintendent, that since that post-mortem 10 days ago I've thought about nothing but this case. I bear no grudge against the Boulanger parents, who are simple folk and who clearly lay the blame on me. Nonetheless, I should be in a tragic position if I failed to discover the truth. Fortunately, I have partially succeeded in doing so." Maigret could scarcely conceal his surprise. He had come to conduct an investigation, and now he found himself confronted, so to speak, with one that had already been carried out, and of which a calm, clear-headed man was making a report. "What day is it today?" "Thursday." "Well, since last Monday, Superintendent, I've had positive proof that poor Olga was not the intended victim." "How did I discover this?" "In the simplest possible way. It was necessary to discover what food the girl had eaten that could have contained the fragments of the rye. As she would never have thought of killing herself, particularly in such an out-of-the-way and extremely painful fashion, some outsider was obviously responsible. Don't you suspect your chauffeur Martin of having had relations with her?" "Indeed, I'm certain he did," agreed Dr. Barayan. "I questioned him on the subject and he ended by confessing." "Had he never lived in the colonies?" "Only in Algeria. But I can assure you right away that you're on the wrong track. With my wife's help and the cook's, I patiently drew up a list of all the articles of food that have been eaten in the house lately, and I even analyzed some of them. On Monday, when I was here in the consulting room, in despair of ever reaching any result, my attention was caught by the sound of footsteps on the gravel, and I saw an old man going towards the kitchen, where he was a regular visitor. It was the man we call Mr. Monday, whom I'd completely forgotten." "Mr. Monday?" Maigret repeated with an amused smile. "That's the name the children have given him, because he comes every Monday. A beggar of the old sort, I was going to say a pre-war beggar, clean and respectable, who goes on a different round each day. Here, it's a Monday. Traditions have grown up gradually, including that of keeping a complete meal for him. It's always the same, for that matter, because we have chicken with rice on a Monday and he eats it peacefully in the kitchen. He amuses the children, who go and chat with him. Quite a long time ago I noticed that he used to bring each of them one of those cream cakes that are called religieuses, and I objected." Maigret, who had been sitting too long, got up, and his interlocutor continued, "You know how tradespeople would sooner give away goods to the poor than money. I suspected that these religieuses must come from some local pastry cooks and that they were probably stale. Not to upset the old fellow, I said nothing about it, but I forbade my son and daughter to touch these cakes." "Which the maid then used to eat?" "Probably. And it was in these cakes." This week Mr. Monday came as usual with his 2 religieuses wrapped up in cream-colored paper. When he had left I examined the pastries, which I'll show you presently, and I found their beards of rye in sufficient quantity to have caused the troubles that resulted in Olga's death. Do you understand now? The intended victims were my children, rather than that poor girl. Their voices could still be heard from the floor below. The room was warm and quiet, save for the occasional swish of a car on the asphalt of the embankment. I haven't told anyone yet. I was waiting for your visit. Do you suspect this beggar of Mr. Monday? Certainly not. Besides, I've not told you everything yet, and the rest of the story will completely exonerate the poor old fellow. Yesterday I went to the hospital, then I called on some colleagues. I wanted to know if any of them had recently recorded any case analogous to that of Olga Boulanger. Hoarse-voiced, he drew a hand across his forehead. And it appears practically certain that at least 2 people died in the same fashion, one nearly 2 months ago, the other only 3 weeks ago. Had they eaten cakes? I couldn't find out, for the doctors had mistaken the cause of death and had not thought an inquest necessary. There you are, Superintendent. I know nothing more, but I've learnt enough, as you see, to be terrified. Somewhere in Neuilly there's a madman or a madwoman who, I don't know how, manages to introduce death into cream cakes. You told me just now that your children were the intended victims. Yes. I'm firmly convinced of that. I understand your question. How does the murderer manage to ensure that it's those particular cakes, Mr. Monday's cakes, that, especially since there have been other cases? I know. I can't explain it. He seemed sincere, and yet Maigret could not resist watching him stealthily. May I ask you a personal question? By all means, forgive me if it's a painful one. The Boulangers accuse you of having had sexual relations with their daughter. The doctor hung his head and groaned. I knew we should come to that. I don't want to lie to you, Superintendent. It's true, it's stupidly true, for it happened stupidly, one Sunday when I was alone here with the girl. I'd give anything in the world for my wife not to find out, for it would hurt her too much. On the other hand, I can give you my word as a doctor that by then Olga had already become the mistress of my chauffeur, so that the child was not mine, I assure you. The dates don't even correspond. In any case, Olga was a good creature who'd never have thought of blackmailing me. You see that, Maigret would not allow him time to pull himself together. And you don't know anyone who... Wait. You spoke of a madman or a madwoman. I did. Only it's impossible, physically impossible. Mr. Monday never goes to her place before coming here. And when he does, afterwards, she leaves him in the street and throws him some coins out of the window. Who are you talking about? About Miss Wilfer. It makes one believe in imminent justice. I adore my wife, and yet there are 2 things I keep secret from her. The first you know already. The second is even more absurd. If it were daylight you'd be able to see, through this window, a house where an Englishwoman, Laurence Wilfer, who's 38 years old, lives with her invalid mother. They are the wife and daughter of the late Colonel Wilfer, a colonial army officer. Over a year ago, when the 2 women came back from a long stay in the south of France, I was called in to attend the daughter, who was complaining of unspecified pains. I was rather surprised, for one thing because I'm not in general practice, and for another because I could find nothing wrong with my patient. I was even more surprised to learn, in the course of conversation, that she was acquainted with all my movements and even my most trivial habits, and I only understood when I came back to this room and noticed her window. I'll cut the story short, Superintendent. Ridiculous as it may seem, Miss Wilfer is in love with me, as may happen to a woman of her age who lives alone with an aged parent in a big gloomy house, hysterically in love. On 2 further occasions I let myself be caught. I visited her, and while I was sounding her she suddenly seized hold of my head and pressed her lips to mine. Next day I got a letter beginning, "My darling." And the worst of it is that Miss Wilfer seems convinced that we are lovers. I can swear to the contrary. Since then I've avoided her. I even had to throw her out of this consulting room, where she came to pester me, and if I haven't mentioned it to my wife it's partly from professional discretion and partly to avoid arousing groundless jealousy. I know nothing more. I've told you everything, as I had made up my mind to do. I'm accusing nobody. I don't understand. But I'd give 10 years of my life to avoid having my wife. Now Maigret understood that his initial composure had been deliberate, contrived by a great effort of will, and the young doctor seemed by now ready to burst into tears in front of him. Make your own inquiry. I wouldn't want to influence you." As Maigret went through the hall, a door opened and two children, a small boy and an even smaller girl, ran laughing past. Martin closed the gate behind the superintendent. Maigret came to know the district, that week, till he was sick of it. With stolid stubbornness, he spent hours pacing the embankment, in spite of the persistently rainy weather and the astonishment of various servants who had noticed him and who conjectured that this suspicious-looking prowler was up to no good. Seen from outside, Dr. Berrien's house seemed an oasis of peace, industry and neatness. Several times Maigret caught sight of Madame Barayon pushing her baby's pram along the riverside. One morning when the weather was fine, he watched the two older children at play in the garden, where there was a swing. As for the Wilfur woman, he saw her only once. She was tall and solidly built, totally lacking in grace, with large feet and a masculine gait. Maigret followed her, on the off chance, but she merely went into an English bookshop in the neighborhood, to change the library books which she took out on subscription. Then Maigret gradually widened the scope of his rambles to take in the Avenue de Neuilly, where he noted two cake shops. The first was dark and narrow, painted outside an ugly yellow, and seemed well enough suited to this sinister business of death-dealing cakes. But the superintendent examined the display in vain, and inquired inside. Religieuses were never made there. The other was the elegant pastry cook shop of the neighborhood, with 2 or 3 small marble tables for tea, the Pâtisserie Bigarreau. Here it was all light and fragrance and sweetness. A rosy-cheeked girl moved cheerfully about the room, while the cash desk was kept by a very genteel lady in a black silk dress. Could it be possible? Maigret could not make up his mind to take action. With the passage of time, as his conversation with the doctor became more remote, the latter's accusations, closely scrutinized, seemed insubstantial, so much so that at times the superintendent felt the whole thing was an absurd nightmare, a story invented, from beginning to end, by a megalomaniac or a criminal at bay. And yet the pathologist's report confirmed Berrien's statement: poor freckled Olga really had died from swallowing beards of rye. And the cakes brought on the following Monday by the mysterious old beggar had also contained a large number of such beards, inserted between the 2 layers of pastry. But might not this have been done at a later time? To crown it all, although Olga's father, who kept an inn somewhere in Finistère, had gone back to his village, his wife, in deep mourning, was still in Paris and spent hours in the waiting room of police headquarters, looking out for Maigret in the hope of getting news from him. Like so many others, she assumed that the police were omnipotent. Tight-lipped, stern-faced, on the verge of anger, she would ask, "And when are you going to arrest him?" The doctor, obviously. And it even seemed as if she were going to accuse Maigret of some devious complicity. He decided, nevertheless, to wait until Monday, and felt almost remorseful about this, particularly as every morning he saw a huge trayful of religieuses, with coffee icing, in the window of the Pâtisserie Bigarreau. Could he take his oath that they did not also contain death? That the girl who was carefully carrying 3 of them away, or the boy who was devouring one on his way home from school, would not suffer the same fate as Olga? By 1 o'clock on Monday he was on guard and not far from the pastry cook's, and not until 2 o'clock did he see an old man whom he recognized without ever having seen him before. It was undoubtedly Mr. Monday, stepping quietly forward, calm and philosophical, smiling at life, savoring the minutes, as it were, crumb by crumb. He pushed open the door of the cake shop with a familiar gesture, and Maigret, from outside, observed Madame Bigarreau and her daughter good-humouredly joking with the old man. They were obviously pleased to see him. His poverty was not of the depressing sort. He was telling them something that made them laugh, until the plump girl finally remembered Monday's ritual, leaned over the window display and chose 2 religieuses which, with a professional gesture, she wrapped in a twist of cream-colored paper. Mr. Monday, quite unhurried, then went into the cobbler's shop next door, where he got nothing but a small coin, and finally to the tobacconist's at the street corner, where he was given a pinch of snuff. There was patently nothing unforeseen about his daily life. And the Monday people here. The Tuesday people in another district, the Wednesday people somewhere else, could set their watches by his visits. He soon reached the Boulevard de la Seine, and his gait became more sprightly the nearer he got to the doctor's house. That was clearly the best house of all, where he was going to get a real meal, the same meal that the family had been eating a little while before, a meal eaten sitting at a table in a clean warm kitchen. He went in by the back door, like a regular visitor to the house, and Maigret rang at the other door. "I'd like to see the doctor immediately," he said to Martin. He was shown upstairs. "Will you ask for the 2 cakes to be brought up right away?" "The old man is downstairs." Old Mr. Monday was eating his meal, unaware that the present he had just brought for the children was being examined by 2 men in the doctor's consulting room. "Nothing there," Barayon concluded after a brief scrutiny. "So there must be some weeks when the cakes were deadly and others when they were harmless." "Thank you. Where are you going?" "Too late." Maigret was on his way out already. "Come in this way, monsieur." Poor Madame Bigereau was horrified at the thought that one of her customers might know she was being visited by a policeman. She showed him into a comfortable little parlor with stained glass in the windows, adjoining the shop. There were jam tarts cooling on every available piece of furniture, even on the arms of the chairs. "I'd like to ask you why you always give 2 religieuses, rather than any other cakes, to the old man who comes on a Monday. It's quite simple, monsieur. To begin with, we used to give him any cakes that were slightly damaged, or left over from the day before. 2 or 3 times it happened to be religieuses, which are pretty fragile. Then we gave him something different, and I remember that on that occasion he insisted on buying 2 religieuses all the same. They bring me luck," he declared. "So as he's a decent old fellow we got into the habit." "Another question, have you a customer called Miss Wilfer?" "Yes." "Why do you ask that?" "No special reason. She's a charming person, isn't she?" "Do you think so?" The tone in which this was said encouraged Maigret to insist. "I mean that she's somewhat eccentric." "You're right there. She's eccentric, as you put it, and she never knows what she wants. If there were many customers of her sort we'd have to double our staff." "Does she often come in?" "Never. I don't believe I've ever seen her. But she rings up and talks half in French and half in English, so that there are very often mistakes." "Do sit down, monsieur. I apologize for leaving you standing. I've finished." "It's I who apologize, madam, for having taken up your time." 3 brief sentences, which had been enough to explain everything, were buzzing away in Maigret's head. The cake shop lady had said of Miss Wilfer, "An eccentric, who never knows what she wants," and then, "If there were many customers of her sort we'd have to double our staff," and a minute later she had admitted that she had never seen the woman, who gave her orders by telephone, half in French and half in English. Maigret had not pressed her further. There would be time enough for that when it came to official questioning, in an atmosphere less sickly sweet than that of the cake shop. Moreover, Madame Bigereau might easily recover her professional pride and keep silence rather than admit to accepting returned goods. For that must be what happened. The remarks she had made could have no other meaning. The Englishwoman gave her orders by telephone, half in French and half in her own language. Then she would send back the cakes that were delivered, on the pretext that there had been some mistake. She would send back the religieuses. The cream cakes into which she'd had time, while the messenger was waiting in the kitchen, to slip some beards of rye. Maigret, with his hands in his pockets, walked towards Dr. Berrien's house, and as he reached the gate he almost collided with Mr. Monday emerging from it. "So you have brought your 2 religieuses," he called out gaily. And as the old man stood there dumbfounded, "I'm a friend of Berrien's. I gather that every Monday you bring the children some cakes. I just wondered why it's always religieuses. Don't you know? It's quite simple. Once I was carrying some that I'd been given and the children saw them. They told me those were their favorite cakes. And so, since they're real nice people such as you don't often meet, who give me the same sort of food as themselves, with dessert and coffee, the lot, you see. Next day, when Maigret called at Miss Wilfer's with a warrant for her arrest, she adopted a haughty attitude, threatened to appeal to her ambassador, and then defended herself at all points with remarkable self-possession. Such self-possession is a further proof of her insanity, said the psychiatrist who examined her. So, in fact, were all her lies. For she claimed to have been the doctor's mistress over a long period and even to be pregnant by him. The medical examination, however, showed her to be Virgo intacta. A thorough examination of the house, furthermore, disclosed a large quantity of ears of rye hidden in a desk. It was learnt, finally, through the woman's mother, that Colonel Wilfer had died in the New Hebrides of multiple perforation of the intestine, resulting from a native plot. Maigret saw Martin again for final questioning. "What would you have done with the kid?" he asked. "I'd have gone off with Olga and we'd have set up a pub in the country somewhere. And your wife?" Martin merely shrugged his shoulders. Miss Lawrence Wilfer, who had been infatuated with Dr. Barillon to the point of wanting to kill his children out of spite, of spying on all his most trivial actions, of poisoning a pastry cook's cakes in her desperate determination to attain her end, and who had had the inspired notion of using the innocent Mr. Monday, without his knowledge, was confined for life to a mental home. And there, for the past 2 years, she has been informing her companions that she is about to give birth to a son.